This is a huge problem. Well, you're very unlikely to be robbed and pillaged unless you have wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so the ability to store wealth across time to decrease the risk of the catastrophes of future, that's the problem in some sense that civilization set out to solve. How can we stabilize things over a long term enough to make long-term investing a reasonable proposition? Here's a positive spin-off of that. So I worked on the UN committee that wrote the Secretary General's report on sustainable development. I worked on the Canadian subcommittee, to be technically accurate, and I was by no means the head of that. I worked with the team that worked on that, but we edited and wrote and rewrote a fair bit of the document. And so I did a lot of work in the background, learning what I needed to learn to work on that committee with some degree of, what would you say, qualification. I read maybe 200 books on ecological development and economic development, the relationship between the two. And
200 books?
Oh, yeah. I was over about a 2-year period. And so, a lot of it was on oceanic management because I did realize that one thing we're doing that's extraordinarily stupid on the ecological front is destroying all the marine life within 40 miles of the shores. And all the marine life is within 40 miles of the shores. Like you think the oceans, they're vast. It's like, right. Yeah, but they're empty, except for where the sun can shine to the bottom. And that's the 40 to 200 miles, say, on the coastal shelves. And we've like trawled those bare like 7 times. It's wild? A catastrophe. So, but that was the only real environmental catastrophe that I encountered in all that work that I thought was both credible and addressable. We know how to fix that. You make marine protected areas like national parks that you need about 15% of the total coastal territory really protected. And that solves that problem essentially. And then everybody has fish because the fish, they don't just stay there, they move around. You can have your cake and eat it too with marine protected areas. But mostly what I learned, and this was really cool, was that this was so cool, and I really believe it's true. The fastest way to make the planet sustainably green and ecologically viable is to make poor people as rich as possible, as fast as we possibly can. Because the thing about poor people is that, well, first of all, they're not resource efficient. They use a lot of resources to produce very, very little outcome. And so that's a problem. Slash and burn agriculture, for example. But even more importantly, when you're insecure on a day-to-day basis, you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you're not paying attention to the broader environment, that hated word, around you. Mm-hmm. And you can't even really worry about your children's future in some real sense because, like, no, you don't understand. Lunch is the future. We don't have lunch, we're hungry, and that goes on for like a month. We're dead. That's the future. So what happens? If you can get resources to the poorest section of the population, as soon as they get to the point where they have some hope of a genuine future, especially for their children, they immediately become concerned about broader environmental considerations. And then the attempt to make the environment habitable and sustainable, that comes up of its own accord at a grassroots level and spreads everywhere. And the evidence for that is clear. And so this is one of the things that really bothered me about COP26. So, and that was based in part on this.
What is that?
That was the big climate meeting in the UK just a few months ago. You know, the one where all the COVID rules were suspended so the important people could talk about important things. In any case, I thought if the politicians who were discussing environmental sustainability were serious, especially the left-wing ones, and I say especially because the left-wing ones always say, well, we care about the poor and dispossessed. It's like, do you really? When push comes to shove. It's like, is it the environment or poor people? If your idea is that we have to limit growth to save the planet. If we limit growth, poor people starve. Because whenever we put limits on economic development, who suffers? The rich? Are you really? That's what you think? And you're on the left, you think if you put limits on economic development, the rich will suffer. That runs contrary to every theory that your whole political philosophy is based on. You put limits to growth on, the poor stay poor or get worse. Doesn't matter because the planet has too many people on it anyways, which it most certainly does not. If you are serious about the environment and even vaguely concerned about poor people, all of your policies would be devoted to making the poor rich as fast as possible. But that would violate the anti-capitalist presumption, let's say, that the reason for environmental degradation in the first place is, say, entrepreneurial and free market development, which it most certainly isn't. That's actually completely backwards. Make poor people rich. So what should a COP26 been about? That's fairly straightforward. It should have been about trying to generate as much energy as we possibly can to be distributed as widely as possible in the cheapest possible manner.